Welcome back, everyone, to the scouting session, our new podcast for myself, Jérôme Bérubé, and Brad Allen. And before we get going, Brad, I want to know, what is your shirt saying?
Here it is. This is a mantis shrimp. It's a real animal. Doesn't come with the boxing gloves as advertised, but the reason they're there is because it's the fastest attacking animal in the world. It's basically the Mike Tyson of shrimps. It's an underwater aquatic predator with the best eyesight in the animal kingdom. You can see in ultraviolet, and it attacks so fast it actually creates bolts of lightning on its prey. So you can look up a mantis shrimp. There's some facts about one of the most unique animals out there.
All right, back to hockey. Yesterday we released episode 1 of our special on our team by team prospect depth chart. The full list is available on hockeyprospect.com. Yesterday we talked about the Pacific Division, and today we're going to focus on the Central Division. And before we get going, just a quick reminder: Brad and I have a podcast now, scouting session. So we're going to talk to each other pretty often, but this time it's going to be recorded. So keep checking this YouTube channel. We're going to have a lot of content this upcoming season. So if you want, subscribe. It's going to help us grow the channel. And as I mentioned in the last episode, this is going to be, most of the time, it's going to be a weekly podcast between Brad and I, and we have a lot of content coming up, a lot of subject to talk about. So we're going to talk about NHL draft, obviously, but sometimes NHL prospects that are already drafted, and sometimes we're going to look back on some previous draft. Like me and Brad, we have nightmares about the 2018 NHL draft, so we might review that draft at some point. So, but for this episode, let's get going here and talk about the Central Division. There you go, Central Division, Chicago Blackhawks. They do have a very, very deep prospect pool here, and obviously we see the top 10 here, but there's a lot of other guys that are not here that might have a chance to play. So obviously. Levchinov is number 1. They just drafted him second overall. Obviously, if you watch our videos from last year, we're not the biggest Levchinov fan. We had him 10th overall on our list. We did a bunch of explanation back in June. So if you want to go back on that, you can go check our older videos on our YouTube channel. Very interesting top 10 to me. Obviously, you look at the forward group. Frank Nazar, the guy we like, but there's some risk to Nazar. Vaneker, Boisvert looks like they might be probably middle 6 forward. They both have size. They both play the right way. What's funny is that we had them reverse based on what Chicago had them. So we had Vaneker ahead of Boisvert. And they had the opposite. They had Boisvert ahead of Vaneker. So very interesting, those two players, to see what they're gonna how they're gonna do this year, but mostly like long term, how is it gonna pan out for those two guys? Oliver Moore is another guy that Chicago got 19 overall in 2023. One of the best skating prospect on the planet. But we do have sometimes some question mark about the hockey IQ of this player, but he's going to play. It's not really a question mark if he's going to play or not. We know he's going to play, but it's probably not going to play as high in the lineup as some people think, or at least some people thought in his draft year. I don't know if they have changed their mind, but we saw him more as a third line player. One goalie here, Adam Guyon. We really like him in his draft year, but really had a tough season this past year with Green Bay in the USHL. Now he's off to college with Minnesota Duluth. It's going to be interesting to see how much games he gets to play this season. But also, it's going to be interesting to see if he can bounce back a bit, because we really liked him in his draft year. and things didn't really go well for him. Mostly in the second half of the season, after like the U20 tournament, I think his game kind of like fell off a bit. Brad, maybe I don't know if you want to talk about Gayan or maybe another prospect, but I'll let you go over here.
Well, Gayan, the big thing with Gayan is he's one of the best athletes out of any goalie prospect, right? There's Askarov, Clara, Gayan. Those are really the big three to me in terms of like freakish athleticism. And so he falls. Emil Vinny is close to that. Timofey Vincov is close to that, right? So there's a couple a bit under, but those are the big three to me in terms of like, whoa, those are freakish looking athletes. My issue with Gayan this past season was like they modified his set stance a bit. I thought he looked more awkward in net. I thought he looked more uncomfortable as well. And usually what happens is like with a goalie, you want to get into a rhythm and get your confidence going. I felt like he never really got into that rhythm this past season for whatever reason. So I wonder with a lighter workload, if that will actually work to his advantage, because then he can continue to try to modify and refine parts of his game, because admittedly he's pretty raw. Right? He was coming from the NHL and he was pretty raw. So it's one of those situations where I don't think it's a bad thing if he actually gets less games so that he can work on his physical development and his technique more often. So there's still the sky's the ceiling type of situation with that player, though. He has all the potential in the world. It just depends on how he develops in college and before he turns pro. The other I'll say is like Roman Kantserev. So this was a player that Jérôme and myself were both pretty high on in his -1 season. I remember when he was with Stelnia, watching him in the playoffs, we really liked what we saw. Super dynamic, dual threat. One of those types of players that like enjoys the spotlight, embraces the spotlight, seems to be a big game player. You can tell that by his production in the playoffs in the KHL this past season. For us, though, like we were not impressed with his lack of power. Like he didn't develop any sort of power skating in his draft year relative to his 16 season. Well, he's an old prospect, right? I think he's a late birthday, September birthday. But it's just the skating for us wasn't where we needed to see for his size. Like the open ice skating specifically, we just thought he'd get drowned out in transition, and then obviously he's going to have trouble on the defensive side of the game. But I mean, he's put together a pretty good season in the KHL. So if he can get another gear to him, I think that might be one where we look back on it and go, oh, it's a Russian we missed, and that's not something I like to do. So good job by Chicago to pick him up where they did, and he's one for me that's probably the dark horse of this group. The other factor with this prospect pool, I'll say, is like you look at Oliver Moore, Frank Nazar, Connor Bedard, they're all small. You look at Lucas Reichel, he's not small, but he plays small. So that's for a prospect. They need some sandpaper. So like you look at Vanacker and Boisvert, like they need to hit. They really do. Those are the types of players. Like before they drafted Levshunov, I really thought they'd lean towards Caden Lindstrom because of that. I thought they'd want to get a giant power center to try to kind of offset the size discrepancy within their top 9, but they didn't do that. They grabbed Levshunov, who's a great prospect in his own right. So it's one of those situations where I really think that look for them to really draft for size in the early rounds. If I was in their position, that's something I would look to do to help with the smaller forwards that they have. Now, the other thing I'll say is like, obviously this is one of the top prospect pools in the sport. I think it's like very debatable between San Jose, Chicago, maybe Anaheim you can throw in there, but like obviously they've done what they need to do, right? They actually like brought in some help for Bedard this season. It's going to be interesting to see the next couple of seasons to see how many of these kids can be impact players like Frank Nazar. Can Nazar and Moore make an impact sooner rather than later?
Yeah. Before we move to the next team, which is the Colorado Avalanche, I just want to mention Ethan Del Mastro, who's a guy who has made huge progress in the last 3 years, since his draft year, basically. Didn't really play in his draft year. It was the COVID, draft year. He only played the U18 that season, so we didn't really get a good read on him. And his 16 years old season in the OHL, it was not a good season. If I remember well, I don't think he played well at the U17. So we just didn't have a good. Our viewings of him were just not good enough in his rookie year in the OHL. But he has made massive progress since then. If you look at where we rank him, 82 looks ridiculous at this point, because like one of the things we didn't like about him in his rookie year was the hockey sense. We thought the hockey sense was just not good enough. So that has changed. And it's, sometimes the hockey sense, it's tough to really improve it. Either you have it or not. But in this case, I think it's just the lack of viewings where, it hurt us. And that 2021 draft, it just, the COVID, I call it the COVID draft year. I mean, there's many examples of us missing on a player because we just didn't have enough viewing. Wyatt Johnson, another OHL guy that we miss, Logan Stankoven, and there's a few other, but I will not name them for now. So yeah, then Astro, massive progress in his 18 years old season, 19 years old season, played well for Canada at the U20, and really strong rookie year last year in the AHL. And I don't think I think he's pretty close to play for the Blackhawks this upcoming season. I think he's going to challenge for a roster spot. You're looking at a guy that's going to be a really strong top 4D in the NHL that can defend and can also produce offensively. So if I'm a Blackhawks fan, I'm pretty excited about how much Del Mastro has improved over the last 3 years. Basically since the Blackhawks took him in the 4th round. So we're not maybe crazy back then ranking him, pretty low, but it looks like a really solid pick by the Blackhawks. That's gonna, make them pretty happy. Moving on to Colorado, again, that's a team with not. Obviously, they have tried to win. They won the cup in 2022, and they have tried to win it again the past few years. So they don't have a lot of prospect or depth prospect-wise. Again, 3 goalies here with Ilya Nabokov, Justus Anunen, and Ivan Yunin. One guy that they acquired via a trade last season, Zakhar Bardakov, is a guy that we actually had a lot of time for him in his draft year back in 2021. So he was a 7th round pick by New Jersey, but we had him ranked 59. He's just a very unique, nasty, potential 3rd or 4th line player. So we don't think he's, doesn't have the talent to be a top 6 forward. But he does really play a nasty, physical game. And obviously, if you look at the ratings here, like a 9 ratings for compete, it tells everything you need to know about that player. They have not had a lot of draft picks, but they had 2 first rounder back in 2023, and those 2 guys are at the top here with Colin Ritchie and Mikhail Grigoriev. Ritchie was a tough one to evaluate in his draft year because he played all year, but inside baseball here, we knew he was hurt all year. Should have got like a surgery, but it played hurt, and it did affect how he played, and it stopped him from being so he had to be careful of not getting hurt, not getting hit too hard. So all year long we were like questioning about like the compete level, but once we knew about the injury, it kind of all made sense. And he had a really strong season last year, and so he made us pretty happy. We kept him at 18 in our rankings in his draft year. And Mikhail Grigoriev, he's a smaller defenseman, but really talented, really good skater. Is he going to be one of those smaller D that have success? I guess the jury is still out, but so far it's looking pretty good for him. Brad, any players you want to maybe touch on here?
Yeah, so I'm sure for some of you, you've seen Oscar Lausen's ranking, probably considered low, but he falls in the category of Edward Chala, Ryan Suzuki, and with him, it's one of those situations where they have all the talent in the world, and they have no understanding how to apply it in a consistent game-to-game basis. They lack energy, they lack will. My quote in the Black Book on Oscar Lausen's draft year was, the phrase "the calm before the storm." what happens if there's no storm to speak of? It's just all calm. That's what he is. There isn't a secondary element to him when he's not scoring. So, and he had the worst out of any player, I think, the last 5-6 years I've scouted. I think the worst puck battling rates out of any player. There's not a puck battle he could win. So one of those situations where, and don't get me wrong, like we had him where Colorado took him. Like we had him before, like where do we rank Jerome? Top 22, 23. So, we had him very similarly ranked to where Colorado probably had him. And that's because he is tremendous. 24. So yeah, he's tremendous talent, incredible in transition, tons of goal scoring potential, just such a naturally gifted player. But it goes to show why so many people that we talk to in this industry, from executives to player development coaches to scouts, the first thing they're going to tell you is like, does the kid have any will? Does he have anything to back up the skill? And that's the issue with these types of players. And, Edward Shallow, we really didn't like Shallow in his draft year. Alausen, we were super concerned, but we kept him up there. Suzuki, the same thing. We were super worried about what would happen if he burned us. But it's at that stage now where I feel like we're a lot more comfortable. If we see this player, we're just going to let him be dropped. And people are going to be upset about that and say, he's way too talented. What are you doing? And we'll explain ourselves with using these examples. The Alex Semin is the best example of this ever. Alex Semin is like an all-time talent. If he had Joe Pavelski's heart, what would that player have been? Right? It would have been a Hall of Famer. He would have been unbelievable. And instead, nobody's ever going to talk about what Semin is, because he never lived up to his expectations. And that seems to be the direction Alausen's taking. The other thing I'll say about this organization is that in net, you got a Noonan, you got Ilya Nabokov, Ivan Yunin. So it's one of those situations where which one of those grabs the split starter role with Georgiev, or does Georgiev end up out of the organization if he has another year like last season? Georgiev is one of the most talented goalies in the NHL, but he's also one of the most sporadic. So he's coming off a Vezina caliber season the year before last, and then he ends up with one of the worst seasons I've seen from a goalie after looking like a Vezina goalie. So it's one of those situations where, can he reestablish himself? And if that's the case, does that mean there's only one slot open for the next several years? And so if that's true, it's going to be a Noonan versus Nabokov in the not too distant future here. So that will be very interesting to monitor. Another thing that's fascinating about them is that when you look at goaltending, we mentioned it with Vegas, about how they're a little, they have a bit of that throwback where they don't mind a blocking style goalie as much. That's less athletic, which you could see in Akira Schmid and Pavel Moisevich and Hill. But with Colorado, they are one of those franchises that actually doesn't mind drafting small. And that's super rare. Most franchises are very, very worried about goaltending size, right? Like anytime I talk to somebody in the industry that with an organization, first thing they'll ask me is just, is he over 6'2"? Right? Is he 6'3" plus? They don't care about the rest until I tell them that. But Colorado's not like that. Alex Georgiev is 6.5 feet tall. Ilya Nabokov is 6 feet tall. Ivan Yunin is 6'1". So it's one of those situations where they're starting to understand, I think, that skating mechanics are far more significant when it comes to being able to appraise if a goalie can actually hold at the NHL level. So I really like the fact that they're willing to kind of distinguish themselves from that perspective. It would be very interesting to see their goalie battle long term.
Actually, like we could say the same thing about smaller defensemen. I mean, obviously they have Cale Makar, which Hall of Famer already, but they have Samuel Girard, another smaller D, and they went out and acquire Walker last year from Philly, another small D.
Malinsky too, right? The college program, Malinsky, yeah.
And so they had, last year in the playoff, they had 3 smaller, under 6 foot defensemen, on their playoff rosters, and then you had Guliadia, who's going to come over at some point. So they're really not afraid of that. They're not afraid to go against what seems to be working in the NHL playoff the last few years. What we saw with Vegas. So Florida last year was a bit of a different makeup as a D, more of a no defenseman under 6 foot, but Montour was a 6 foot defenseman. Forsling was a 6 foot defenseman. So it's very interesting how Colorado doesn't really care about any of those things. They just think they have the right mix. For this to work on playoff time. So it's remains to be seen. Me personally, I don't think you cannot have too many of them. So But obviously, yeah, Kale McCarr was a Hall of Famer already. Anyway, that's a very interesting mindset how they are building their team with like goalies wise, but also like their defensemen. If we move on to the next team, the Dallas Star, which is a team that has burned us quite often in the last few years with some of their prospect. I mentioned early on Wyatt Johnson, that guy has burnt us. Stankoven is another guy that's gonna burn us. So it's not really a deep prospect pool, but I'm a bit scared of being too down on some of their prospects, because I feel like Dallas has really done a good job of like making us look bad on some of our rankings. And the number one example here is Emil Lemming, not a guy that we were really high on. We tried to really like him all year, but it just never happened for us. Just the lack of compete was, it's not something we were looking for in prospect. So I'm looking for Emming to start competing and being a high compete guy next year, and it's gonna make me and the whole hockey prospect staff look bad on that one. And Emming will play in the OHL this upcoming season with Barry, so that's going to be an interesting player to follow. But they do have some really good players. Logan Stankoven, obviously we saw him with the Stars at the end of the year and in the playoff. How can you not like this player? We definitely missed the boat on him in his draft year, but again, this was the COVID draft year. Didn't play a lot of games. We saw the skating, we saw the size. We just said, is it going to work? Is it going to work out? And the answer is yes, it's going to work out. And we're not looking too good on that one. Liam Biscal, we absolutely love this defenseman. Obviously, he's not going to be a first pairing defenseman, but there's not many defensemen in today's game that are mean and nasty like Biscal is. I don't think he's far off the NHL. I think he needs some seasoning in the American Hockey League. But he played really well in Sweden last season. He had a long playoff run with his team. I think his team lost in the final in the SHL. Maverick Bork, just a very good all-around player. Did really well in the American Hockey League this season. Question mark for him remains the size skating combo. It's not bad, but it's also not like really good either. So it's always a question mark for those players who are a bit undersized and are not really fast. It's always a bit of a challenge, but he's a really smart hockey player. And the rest of their top 10 is the second half of that top 10. I don't know if there's any of them becomes like a full-time NHLer. I feel like their top three is pretty solid. Emil Lemming, he has potential, and we just didn't believe in him, and we end up ranking him 50, and the Stars took him 29. So definitely they were really high on him. They probably had him in their top 20, if not top 25. But the rest of their top 10, I'm personally not too crazy about any of them. Brad, maybe you want to mention someone here in that top 10 here?
Yeah, like Chase Wheatcroft was actually pretty interesting when he was signed. He did have a huge year in the dub before he was signed and has some offensive potential. He was definitely like one of those long plays, though. He needs to really develop like calibrating the ability to understand when to time spinning off pressure, how to absorb contact correctly, really play more of a pro game. But there's some interesting aspects to him that might make him a fringe player. But the big one for me is Bixell. Bixell is everything to this organization because Hakanpää's exit. They absolutely need this player to hit. This player is incredibly important to them when it comes to their playoff runs. Like in the next 2-3 years, I really think that he could be a massive difference maker if things go right. And there's no players like you. Like he's Scott Stevens of this era. He is the eraser, right? There's nothing like him. He brings a physical presence that is just not like any other player in the NHL right now. He strikes fear into opposing players. He is scary. There's mean, and then there's Big Cell mean. We call him the Bismarck for a reason. He's built like a battleship, plays like a battleship. He's a beast. The kid's a beast. So it'll just be about if he can hold. If his exits, which was the issue in his draft year, if his exits can hold the NHL level, and he can just simplify his game enough where he's not a liability out on the ice when he's trying to make passing plays and stretch the length, then he's going to be extremely useful, and he could be one of the biggest difference makers for Dallas long term.
Just super fun player to watch play. Like when you watch Biscal, you just sometimes start laughing at some of the things he does on the ice. Just really entertaining defenseman. Let's move on to Minnesota here with their top 10. Obviously at the top here is Zev Buum, who for some reason dropped on draft day, but we ranked him third overall on our list. We think he's a first pairing defenseman, and he had a fantastic college season last year with Denver. I don't think he's far off the NHL. I believe he's going back to Denver for a second year, but he's a phenomenal defenseman. Doesn't make a lot of mistakes out there, and can quarterback your power play. I think Minnesota got a really massive steal here with the 12th pick in the draft. Jesper Wallstedt, really, really solid goaltending prospect, who's been doing pretty well in the AHL. Danila Yurov, I feel like I've been watching Danila Yurov for like 5-6 years. He's been on the the first time I saw him, I believe it was 2019 at the U17 playing for Team Russia. He was, really solid back then. His early birthday, so he was, he took an extra year to get drafted. He's been playing in the KHL, really solid player. I think he's going to be really good when he comes over, and he's going to be ready for the NHL pretty quickly. This is an interesting top 10 after that. Liam Ogren, Ryder Ritchie, Damon Hunt, Carson Lambeau's at number 9. A lot of guys that just we're not huge fan of. I think, well, in Ogren case, we did like him in his draft year, but I don't think the progression has been, as good as we, projected back then. So maybe the upside is not as high as we thought it was going to be. Because Nidinov, really fun player, undersized obviously, but really phenomenal skater. Plays at a high tempo, high pace, competes hard. Who's the player, Brad, you want to maybe focus here a bit more?
I really like Marat Kusnedinov. I think he's one of the wild cards for the Wild long term. Pardon the pun, but it's one of those situations where there's not many players in their organization that's like him. He's an incredible defensive specialist in some ways that you Wild fans will see shortly. But he also brings a ton of energy, and he's a fantastic skater. So there's transitional upside offensively as well. Not a great executor. He's not going to be a high-end finisher. He's not going to be a high-end point producer, but he's going to be a very useful Swiss Army knife style of player that brings a lot of defense to his game. They got the seal of the draft and Zev Buum, in our opinion. We had Zev the top-ranked defenseman last season. So for us, obviously, or last draft, I should say. So that, Zev to us is just, I think it's the right move to go back to college. He needs to continue to develop his toolkit. The skating in straight lines is really the only real issue. Well, I shouldn't say the only real issue. There's other mechanical issues with his skating as well. As linear crossover mechanics are kind of sloppy. So there's aspects he can improve in terms of his edge work and his skating overall. And then he can do that at the college level at a much easier rate than trying to make the NHL. So I think that's the right decision. Jesper Wallstedt is definitely a top 5 goalie prospect in hockey right now. He's kind of fixed his issues that I had with him, which is lateral transfer rates, which were below average in his draft season. He's not a great athlete, but he makes up for it, obviously, with incredible tracking ability and just a natural understanding and reading of the game. But he's improved a lot. He looks the part, and I think he's going to actually be much more impactful than people think, because I am not a fan of Philip Gustafsson. I think Philip Gustafsson is more of the Vitek Vinicic mold, where they have one great season and then people are like, maybe this is a starter. I don't think that's the case with. I don't think he's more than a backup if that. I'm not high on Gustafsson at all. So I think Wallstedt has a potential to come in and be a high impact goalie very, very shortly. The other thing is Danila Yurov. He's Russian, so typically you think of a Russian who needs to come over. The first thing you have to do is learn how to play a more team-oriented style and stop holding the puck so often. But that's not Danila Yurov at all. He's an incredibly mature player. He always was, even at 16. Incredibly advanced in terms of understanding how to use his teammates. So when Yurov does, end up in the NHL, I think it's going to be a very quick adaptation. So that's one thing that I'm excited to watch, and I'm sure Minnesota Wild fans will be excited too. The other is Liam Ogren. I'm with you, Jérôme. I think we had him a bit overrated, and the main reason is it seems like he's had to streamline his game professionally at a level I didn't expect. So I remember watching him in those Svensson playoffs the year before last, and it was one of those situations where it's just all north-south and transitional shooting, and that wasn't what he was in his draft year. There was a lot more there. So I'm wondering if he can tap into some of that. If he can't, then he's not going to be the player we thought he was, but it doesn't mean he can't play, and that's why he's ranked fifth on our list. I know for some of you probably reading this, Ryder Ritchie's too low. For me, it's not low enough. I'm not a fan of this player at all. I think he's was incredibly overrated last season. I don't think he thinks the game well whatsoever. He had some of the worst playmaking rates I've ever seen. And I just think he's just kind of too one-dimensional. He's not a 200-foot player at this time. But don't get me wrong, he could absolutely develop into something. It's just for my money, he fell into the Charlie Stramel territory for me, where I know that's a sour note, but Stramel to me was basically a no draft, and Ryder Ritchie was basically a 6th, 7th rounder. So there's definitely a bit of a philosophical difference with how the Wild approach their drafts relative to how we view it and I view it, but that doesn't mean we're right. Like Riley Heidt, I'm sure, is another player. You guys are confused why he isn't there. Riley Heidt is a fantastic talent, dual threat. He does have potential. We could be wrong here. So we absolutely could get this one wrong, but I mean, he's not very fast. He's not big, and there's a whole lot lacking off the puck. Internationally, he was flat. In all my viewings, I've never been a big fan. Again, there's philosophical differences here with a lot of how Minnesota does their thing. That doesn't mean they can't develop them. It doesn't mean we're right. We just explained a couple times there how wrong we were. I mean, Ethan Del Mestro is going to go down one of the worst misses we've had, and it's Logan Stankoven is another where it's like there's no excuse for it either. Like, yeah, his mechanics were awful. One of the worst skaters you ever see, but it doesn't matter. Sometimes some kids just get it, and they're going to overcome their deficits. And we should have recognized that was Stankoven, and we didn't. So we're not going to make excuses. But the Minnesota's prospect pool is kind of scary, because if they hit, well, that means we got to go back to the evaluation board here, figure out what we're missing relative to what Minnesota's doing, right? So but I really like their top three. I think I have all the time in the world for Z Boom, Jesper Wallstedt, and Danila Yurov. And I should say top four, and Kuznetsov. I'm a huge fan of those four prospects. So it's not like they don't have a pretty top-heavy system there.
At number 10, they have, just to finish on Minnesota here, at number 10, they have Aaron Kiviharju. I don't know if it's going to work out for him, but I'm kind of cheering for him. He's been pretty unlucky with injury. He has missed pretty much 2 full seasons because of injuries. One, I believe he was 14, missed a full year with a knee injury, and last season he missed most of the season. And he's a smaller D, doesn't skate well, but he has strong character. I like some of the quote he had to say after the draft. Kind of like I'm cheering for him, and I'm also looking forward to see how he does this season with I believe he's still with TPS in the Liga in Finland. So I'm looking forward to see how he does, and if he can have a solid season, and maybe prove us wrong, because we rank him 69. Minnesota got him 122, so he was not really a popular player come draft day, but super smart. So let's see. Let's wait and see how he does this season. Moving on to Nashville Predators. They have if you see the top 10 here, they have one of our favorite player ranked at number 1, Yegor Surin. Impossible to not like this player, and even more impossible is when you see some of his interviews. Like, tremendous kid,
super funny. And, when you're funny in a language that you barely speak, that's pretty impressive. So that's definitely a player to. He's playing in the KHL this season. He's not getting a lot of ice time. Obviously, that's just part of the process in Russia for some of those young prospect playing in the KHL. Outside of after Sorin in the top 10 here, David Edstrom, Tanner Molendyk, that we really love his game. He's a smaller D, about 5'11", 6 feet, but tremendous skater. Defends really well. He's got some upside offensively too. He can make some plays. Matthew Wood is maybe the guy that has dropped the most based on his past season, where he just was not good enough at UConn. Was not good with Canada at the U20 as well. He left UConn. He's going to play at Minnesota this season. Let's see what a new team is going to do for him at the college level. But he's going to have to be much better than what he was last year. And obviously, he has two issues for us that are a bit concerning. The skating is concerning, obviously, but if you're a bad skater, you have to compete really hard. That's going to help you a bit. Well, he doesn't really compete all that hard, so that's the two main issue we have with Wood. Like, he's pretty smart, he's talented, but if your skating is below average and you don't really compete hard on the ice, that's a bit of a problem for us. That's why he has drop here. Joachim Campbell, he's kind of like similar to Lekaramaki, I guess. Very high, a high volume shooter. And he has done pretty well in the American Hockey League, but he's not the smartest player as well. That's why he's a bit lower here. After that, I think Svechkov, Lerber, Schaefer, all three play in the AHL together last year. I guess I would say Lerber was the guy who had the best season out of those three players, but he's still a 5'11" power forward with average foot speed. So there's a bit of some concern here. And also, he does take a lot of penalties, really a lot of bad penalties. So that's a bit of a concern. It was the same thing in junior. A lot of selfish penalties. So that's going to be interesting how he can adapt a bit and learn from this in his second pro year this upcoming season. Brad, I'll let you go on anybody you want to talk about here on the Predators prospect list.
Sure. Well, I'll start by just from an organizational perspective. If you look at their players and what they got, Sir and Edstrom, Fyodor Svechkov falls into this. Leroux, they're hard to contain. They're just very awkward to defend. They're just a ball of chaos, and they kind of do it their own way. And they're menaces. Some of these kids are like David Edstrom is going to be a net front presence. He's going to be very difficult to deal with. Igor Surin is a just chaotic ball. He's a monster physical presence. One of the strongest kids outside of the NHL already. He's just one of the strongest prospects in the game. And he was young. He's super young for his draft. He was August birthday, Jerome, or something like that.
Yeah.
Super, super young for the class. So just a physical freak in nature for his age category. And Leroux, same thing, right? Just powerful kids that are really good at being able to drive net front. So there's definitely an approach there where they obviously the Predators want this style of player, and they're trying to acquire as many of them as they can get. So a couple things. So first, Igor Surin works the exact opposite of what we just discussed with Danila Yurov. Danila Yurov was a 200-foot, incredibly mature player that understood how to play in a system and knew how to use his teammates to complement his game. Igor Surin is the exact opposite of that. Igor Surin is a one-on-one individual specialist who wants to run through everything and do everything himself. That's okay, because you'll always take a player that you need to drop back and get them to learn how to contain their own game than a Suzuki or an Alauza situation where they're just trying to ignite them the whole time. So I think it makes a lot of sense that he goes to the KHL because he's going to finally have to understand why structure is important in limited minutes. So, limited minutes can be a very hit and miss subject. Like it didn't work with Balat Shafigulin's development in LA, for instance. He didn't get enough playing time, didn't get to learn how to develop a unique power forward game. Now he's not a prospect anymore. He's not coming over, right? So it can go both ways. It can either end up helping them develop, or it can be a curse for them. I think it can be the right decision here for Surin, though. The other thing I'll say is that Matthew Wood is definitely the wild card here. He could easily end up number one if we look at it long term. This is the kid with the highest ceiling, remarkable dual threat ability, very unique game. One of the most subtle intelligences that I've scouted in a bit, like just his skating route timing and how he manages to manipulate opposing defensemen to slow him down slightly so that he can gain a route advantage. Things like that really matter to a player like that because, as Jérôme mentioned, not a good skater whatsoever. One of the worst skaters outside of the NHL that actually matters, really. Like there's Nico Huhtinen and Matthew Wood, and those are the two ugliest skaters that are not currently playing in the NHL that do actually matter as prospects. So he'll be the big one for me because I really think it's a clear, like David Edstrom's going to play, right? There's no question. David Edstrom's going to play in some sort of capacity. Tanner Mollendijk is just way too gifted a skater, way too tenacious. He'll at least be a puck mover at some capacity at the NHL level. It's when you get to like Joachim Kemmel, for instance, where it's like, oh, okay, he might not make it. Fyodor Svechkov is probably another one we should talk about, Jérôme, where it's like, I don't think his development has gone as smooth as it could have, but he's also a pretty interesting prospect. He's one of those players that could develop into a unique defensive-oriented center that could be extremely useful still. And he does have some. He's never been a high executor. He's not a goal scorer by nature, but his handling ability, his skating combination, his frame, like he has the ability to bypass the first layer. He's an intelligent player. He has deception to him. He's one for sure that I'm very interested to continue to monitor. And that's kind of this pool. You look at Surin and you look at Matthew Wood and Kemmel, Svechkov, right down to Felix Nilsson even. Like they all have some very interesting, unique specialization and qualities that take usually more time for them to simmer. You got to let them cook, right? These are those slow cooker type of prospects, and that's always usually the case when it comes to power forwards that are developing or unique hyper finesse oriented dual threats like Matthew Wood. It's just these players need way more time than usual prospects do. So it's one of those situations where I think with Barry Trotz and co, like Barry Trotz is one of the best former coaches in the industry. So he knows the developmental timelines are usually what it takes, right? And that could be extremely useful in terms of making sure that they hit their windows of when these players are actually capable of coming in and playing for the Predators.
Yeah, if you look at, Reed Schaefer, he was the key player they got traded with Edmonton, and he was Edmonton got him, the 32nd overall pick in 2022. He had a great last year in junior with Seattle. First pro year, really, really tough first pro year for him, but he still remains a guy with some potential, but it's going to take a bit longer. I think that, what maybe people thought maybe a year ago. Teddy Stiga is a guy we liked for the draft last year. Really nice, smart, winger for the U.S. national team. He's off to college this season, so he's it's going to take a while, obviously, for him. But he's a good smart hockey player that maybe in 3-4 years is challenging for a roster spot in Nashville. So interesting, very unique and interesting top 10. As far as like prospect pool for Nashville here. St. Louis is our next team. Very interesting top 10 here for the Blues. If you look at the top 4 mainly, if you look at Jimmy Snuggerud is a guy we really love in his draft year. We ranked him 14. He only went 23 in the draft. But to be fair, I don't think he had a spectacular season last year. I don't think at the U20 he was outstanding either. He's going back to college for a third season. I think he really wants to win a national championship at Minnesota. He's going to play with Matthew Wood this year. I don't know if it's going to be on the same line, but that could be a good a good duo for Minnesota here. Dvorsky, it's a player we like, but don't think he even if he had like pretty good looking stats this past season with Sudbury after he left Sweden for Sudbury. I don't think he really, at least in my viewings, and it's based on OHL viewings and also U20 viewings. Don't think he really. I was not overly impressed by his season. Like he was good, but not as good as I. So I feel like he might have been. We might have ranked him a bit too high come the 2023 draft. Obviously, we ranked him 10th. He went 10 to St. Louis. I mean, the stats in junior don't matter. Right? So people will look at the stats and think he had a fantastic season, but I was not overly impressed by him this past season. Adam Juracek, unfortunately for him, he was hurt for most of the season. Well, mainly for the second half of the season. When he played in the first half, he was a bit of a up and down. Felt like he struggled in a Czech league. He's off to play in the OHL this season, so we'll see how that does it for him. But we had a lot of time for him, but he just didn't deliver enough for us to keep him high on our list based on what we had him before a year prior to his draft. But maybe the guy who's really interesting here, Brad, is Theo Lindstein, who was draft 29 overall. I don't know if you want to touch on him, but he had a really strong season this past year.
Yeah, I loved him. I pleaded with Mark to keep putting him up as high as he's willing to put him. He's the minute eater. He's one of those prospects where you're not going to end up on a highlight reel, but he's the 5-on-5 minute eater that St. Louis desperately needs. Out of any prospect in the top 10 here that I think really needs to develop, it is Theo Lindstein. Theo Lindstein is incredibly important to this organization going forward, and he's doing really well. Trajectory's there, very intelligent player, incredible stretch playmaker. Just his first pass is beautiful. Understands how to recognize layers and thread passes through them. Knows how to slow down the forecheck. Knows how to manipulate his first option so he can create a secondary option for himself on the weak side when he's trying to exit the zone. As an example, retrieval rates are going to be very good. Not physical. I wish if you could just combine Quentin Burns in terms of the physicality, and then have Theo Lind, then you're really talking. But he's a cerebral defenseman who anticipates the play in advance and uses his advanced positioning to get the job done defensively. Not a menace in terms of the defensive side. They're not dealing with a big cell type of situation. One thing that's very interesting about this organization is that when you look at when you're doing this for 7, 8 plus years, decade plus, you start picking up on trends, and I would argue that St. Louis's drafts are usually actually the most predictable. That is not a negative. That is not meant to be a bad thing. What it means is that they're very cohesive in terms of what they're trying to find. And the evaluation for me in terms of trying to predict what they're doing always is the same, which is, are they competitive? St. Louis seems to have a mandate that's generalized through their organization where they do not like a player if that player lacks compete in any capacity. If you look at, like, for instance, the top three, Snuggerud, Juracek, Dvorsky, those are all incredibly competitive players. Theo Lindstein, he's not physical, but the way he competes is through the consistency and the minute eating and just the ability to stay focused that entire time, which it does matter. Conditioning plays a role in that. And you look at, like, Juraj Pekarczyk, one of my favorite dark horse Slovakians from his draft. He's an incredibly competitive player. Quentin Burns, right? So that's like the staple St. Louis type of pick. And what's really interesting to me is they seem to have gone in this direction directly at the same time we made the same miss that we had, which is Dominic Bach. They drafted Dominic Bach. One of the least competitive forwards you'll ever watch, but incredibly talented. We had him ranked incredibly aggressively, as did St. Louis, and it burned both of us. And St. Louis seems to have modified their draft strategy based off of Bach, just like we have. Like, again, Dominic Bach, Oscar Lausen, Ryan Suzuki, the list goes on. That type of player is incredibly dangerous. And when they miss, it's very ugly, right? And so it seems like St. Louis is gone into a direction where they're really emphasizing high energy competitive players that are willing to go outside their comfort zone in order to make plays. And that's not a bad thing when it comes to playoff hockey.
Yeah, and maybe the depth is lacking a bit. If you look at number 10, they have Zach Dean, just has not been really good since his draft year, pretty much. Vegas traded him pretty quickly after they took him in the first round in 2021, and he had a really tough first pro year. So let's see if he can rebound. But it's been a few years where his play has not been really good. Let's move on to the next team, and maybe my favorite prospect pool that we're going to talk about, the Utah Hockey Club. If you look at the top 10 here, Dmitry Simachev, Iginla, Daniel Butte, Lamoureux, Michael Rabel, Cole Baudouin, Josh Doan, Artem Duda, Suber, the German D, and then another German prospect in Julian Lutz. Very, very impressive top 10. Obviously, I'm a huge Simachev and Daniel Butte fan. I was in their draft year. Iginla, same thing last year. We're really high on him. Lamoureux has made some really nice progress. Was not really good in his draft year. Really struggled under pressure. Has made really good progress with that. He's still a bit injury prone. If he becomes at least a number 4, number 5 D, I think Utah is going to be really happy with him. Michael Rabel in net. It's been a bit up and down for him since his draft year, but he still remains a pretty solid prospect. I don't know, Brad, if you want to maybe quickly mention Rabel, but there's a ton here to talk about in that top 10.
Yeah, I'll mention. I'll start with a generalization. So we just talked about how it's kind of uniform with how St. Louis selects players, what they're looking for. I think you could say the same thing about Utah to a degree. So Utah's draft philosophy is draft unicorn players, draft athletic freaks of nature. If you look at Simachev, one of the best skater defensemen outside the NHL, Daniel Butte is a decent to above average skater. Basically everywhere relatively, like he's a monstrous frame on him. He's like 6'5.5", 6'6". He's going to fill into 230, and he skates well above average for that frame. I feel like, especially in straight lines. Maverick is a monster, one of the freakiest defensemen you'll ever see. Toolsy, Michael Hrabel, incredibly toolsy goalie, and then Julian Lutz is one of the best skaters outside the NHL. So it's one of those situations. You look at what they want, the toolkits. They're willing to fill in the rest as long as the kid comes equipped with the toolkit. That seems to be their draft philosophy, and it is fascinating because there's more variance when you're drafting for toolkits, and you have to take a lot more variables into consideration, especially because they're usually raw in some considerable way, unless you draft them exceptionally high, like Simachev and Butte were. Right. But Julian Lutz, for instance, incredibly raw player when they drafted him in the second round. But I was very high on Lutz. I thought he had a tremendous amount of potential. I'm not as bullish as I used to be. I do think he can still be a depth forward that offers a tremendous amount of speed in transition and can be something. But that's the bet they took, right? And that's what's interesting is there's some organizations that prefer taking smaller players that are more intelligent, and then they try to help develop the toolkit and the skating within that player. And in Utah's case, it's the opposite. So now, don't get me wrong, could some of this actually not come down to philosophy, and it's just that's the player at that spot that made sense for them in that moment? Yes, of course, there's some of that could happen too. But in terms of like absolute ceilings, like if their top 6-7 players here hit, oh my goodness, Utah's going to have a team on their hands. They have so much potential. It's I guess the most stable prospect here that I'm looking at the top 10 is Iginla. Like, I'll be very surprised if he's not at least just a straight up 30 goal scorer. If he doesn't, if he's not a top 6 30 goal scorer in the NHL, it's really hard. It's already really hard to scout, as we know. These types of players have to hit, or it just makes our life incredibly uncomfortable. Like I always joke, it's like, well, if Celebrini doesn't hit, Like, what is scouting, right? Like, there has to be a cutoff point of like, what's the expectation about being able to project some of these kids at this age. But I love their prospect pool. I'm with Jerome. I know Jerome, one of his favorite players is Daniel Butte. Daniel Butte is one of the most unique power playmakers in the game. He has the just unbelievable upside, more upside than Elmer Soderblom. And I would argue the same upside as Tage Thompson, but they operate very differently. Tage Thompson's greatest asset is his wheelhouse and how he operates his one-timer. That is actually Daniel Butte's weakness. Daniel Butte's greatest asset is how he can set up his advanced playmaking with his handling frame combination and do it at high speeds. And it just is very difficult to contain. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this group of prospects develop, because if they develop correctly, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch any of Butte's preseason game in the KHL this season, I mean, his playmaking was on full display. I mean, I think him with playing with Radulov on his line is like the best thing that could happen to him. Radulov is just a beast still. Like, he's 37, 38 years old. He's still a beast. He still competes. He still goes inside, and I think he's going to teach a lot to Butte to get ready for the NHL, what like really the NHL game is like. And Butte is just a beautiful playmaker. He finds Radulov and the other line mate quite easily in the offensive zone, and with his frame, his reach, I mean, he can do a lot of different things offensively along the boards, and obviously the playmaking, the vision is, it's pretty high end for a 6'6", 19 years old player. So he's a very unique player. And just to conclude on Utah, maybe a guy we didn't mention is Artyom Duda. A guy we really like in his draft year, a guy who could play 30 minutes a game and not make one mistake. In his draft year, he was really impressive young defenseman. He had a bit of a challenging year this past season just because he tried to go play college hockey at Maine. It didn't work out for him, so he didn't have anywhere to go. He couldn't go play in pro hockey in North America. He didn't want to go back in Russia, so he ended up playing, in Canadian university for. I think he joined Toronto University by the month of November, I believe, or December. So he's now signed by Utah. So he's going to start his pro career at this upcoming season. But he's a guy we really like, really solid skater, above average size, can move pucks, and doesn't make a lot of mistakes out there. So a guy to keep an eye on if you're Utah fans watching this podcast here. Keep an eye on Artyom Duda. He's going to be in the AHL this season. And our last team we're going to talk about in this episode is the Winnipeg Jets. Very interesting top 10 here for me. Obviously, Colby Barlow had some injury concern last season. I believe it was a back injury, but still scored a lot of goals when he came back. Look, we had him pretty high at 6 overall in his draft year. He went 18. Maybe we had him too high. It's going to be interesting. He's going to try obviously to make the Jets, but there's a lot of trade rumors around him in the OHL. He might get moved out of the Owen Sound. I think that would be good for him to go to a new team. Brad Lambert is a guy that we talk about him for so many years, and we really struggled with him in his draft year. Unbelievable skater. We just didn't trust the hockey sense for him. What have you seen maybe this past year in his first pro year? He had a solid rookie year in the AHL. He also got some NHL game at the end of the year. Where are you at with Brad Lambert? So he went 30 in the draft. We had him 29. So pretty much the same range as us.
So this player, it drove us crazy, huh? So I had him in a range from 20 or 19 to 35, and I was flipping him around the whole year within that range. And I had him right up the end at 19, and then I moved him back again into the early 30s, early to mid 30s, and I felt that was very comfortable for him. And then I remember the last 3 games he played in the season. They were international friendlies. I was like, oh, you know what? I haven't seen a ton of him in junior this year. Driving me nuts in league. Let's watch them. He was so good. I was like, oh no, this is not this. Anything but don't do this to me now, right? And it was like one of those situations like I should have met him halfway. We should have met him halfway. You should maybe have moved him up towards the early 20s. And that said, there's some aspects of this player that we really won't know until he's actually in the show full time. So there's a couple aspects of it. So first is he has the best toolkit outside the NHL. He's an incredible skater, as Jérôme mentioned. We're talking Nathan McKinnon, Connor McDavid skating levels. He is unbelievable at skating the puck. One of the best zone entry machines that will be coming into the sport. That said, he is not that intelligent with the puck on his stick. His routes off the puck are pretty decent. His offensive instincts of when to time himself, find space are decent to above average, but his playmaking ability and his ability to execute gets dramatically reduced the more dynamic he attempts to be, which means that for me, in order to translate his game to the NHL level, he has to simplify his offensive playmaking so that he can give up the puck quick and then use his beautiful skating to get himself in a position where he can make things happen. So his rate of execution is going to keep him from being a star player. And then you look at his hockey sense and his playmaking ability, I think that brings him down another notch. So I know for a lot of you listening, one, you're shocked that you see Barlow ahead of him. Don't get me wrong, it really could go the other way. We're trying to give Barlow his due as a result of how bullish we were and because of his injury. But if Barlow has another season like he did last and Lambert takes off again, obviously Lambert's going to be the guy to beat in the organization. But the thing with Lambert is like, he's going to be one of those players that is going to score some incredible end-to-end goals. He's going to be this dynamic puck rushing threat that just beautiful goals in transition and shows up on a highlight reel. Some people are going to be like, that's a star player when he's having his best games. The problem with Lambert is you will find out in time that his hockey sense is going to not only limit him, but also make him a detriment to his own team at times. So for me, it's all about how much can he make up and compensate for that by becoming a very good defensive forward. If he can become a 200-foot forward to compensate for that, then he can still be really, really effective player. But as of right now, I really think of him more as a middle 6 forward. So yes, I think we had him a bit too low, but not to the degree that people might think. I think this player is still very misunderstood. Like, if this player could think the game, like Brad Lambert would have been top 3-4 all day in the draft. Not even a question. It's just he doesn't really think the game that well. And for a lot of you, I know you've seen his production in the AHL, and I know for some of you are like, well, you guys are, full of it. Like, you just had him too low. You're compensating. This is nonsense. But believe us, like we're always on it when it comes to making mistakes. We want to make sure we can correct for them. And right now, like, yes, his production's there, but there are some missing elements. And the other thing I'll say before I give it back to Jérôme here is that when you look at their organization, that's fast. This is the team that's going to be one of the fastest NHL teams for years if these kids hit. Brad Lambert's the best skater outside the NHL. Alphonse Frey and Elias Salmonson are brilliant skaters in their own right. Braden Yeager is a fantastic skater in open ice. Really, like, the only skater here I'm like in the top 10. Oh, Kevin He is another excellent skater. So, and a fantastic transitional upside with these players. The one player here on this list where I'm like, whoa, he can't skate that well, but he's a phenomenal talent. That's Dmitry Reshevsky. Reshevsky is their outlier there. Is fantastic talent, incredibly dynamic. If Brad Lambert thought the game like Dmitry Reshevsky, oh my God, right? Like, that's a superstar, but he doesn't. So can Reshevsky come over after this year? Is he going to, like, that's the huge debate with Reshevsky. We talked to his agent. His agent said he has no interest in coming to the NHL, and then he gets drafted the year after that. So it's one of those scenarios where if Winnipeg gets a bit lucky and he's willing to come over, you get Brad Lambert coming in at the same time as probably Salomonsson and Reshevsky. Whoa, that's a different looking lineup right there. So there'll be huge influx of talent coming in together for Winnipeg that Winnipeg desperately needs.
I believe so far that's our second episode we're doing. So we did the Pacific Division, now the Central Division. I think they are the only team who have 3 players with a rating of 9 for skating. Lambert with a 9, Salomonsson with a 9, and Alphonse Frey with a 9. I don't think there's any other team who have 3 players that have that 9 rating for skating. So
and that doesn't mean they're equal, though. We should probably say that. That does
Yeah,
not mean we give them an equal grade. It just means, like, if you see a 9 from us, it just means that's basically an elite skater, but that doesn't mean they're all exactly the same, right? Like Brad Lambert's the best of those 3, for instance, and you can make debates about mechanics relative to power output and everything with all of them, right? So it's just when you look at our rating systems, try to think of them as just a very basic generalization. They are not meant to be taken in stone in any capacity. I want all of you listen to this to know that it's not. Don't look at the ratings and be like, oh my God, they gave this guy a 5 here and then a 6 over. Like, try not to pay too much attention. It's very much a generalist thing to just give you a very basic understanding of, like, how an overview almost of the player.
Yeah, and just FYI, we don't give 9 really easily. There's not many in each year when we do the black book. There's not many 9. If you get a 9 ratings, because it's like you said, Brad, it's elite. So it's pretty interesting to see Winnipeg has gone the skating route for their draft with Lambert, Salamonson, and Frey. So it's going to be interesting, and that's going to wrap up the Central Division episode. We're going to be back tomorrow with Atlantic Division episode. So we're going to a lot of good prospect in that division. So we're going to talk about it tomorrow. Obviously, don't forget, if you like this video, like our you can subscribe to our YouTube page. It's going to be really helpful to give us a bit more of an exposure on YouTube. And we will talk to you tomorrow.